My husband filed for divorce the day I lost our baby. My lawyer said, "Don't agree," but I silently signed every document. He didn't know I had already won. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I missed the signs. Honestly, I didn't miss them. I just chose to believe in what I had built. Our house, our life, our 13 years together. Maybe that's the same thing as missing them. I'm not sure anymore. My name is Claire Morrison. I was 34 years old when my marriage ended. I'm an architect. I design buildings for a living. Structures that are supposed to stand up under pressure, hold their shape when the world pushes against them. Funny, isn't it? I spent my career calculating load-bearing walls and stress points, and I never once calculated the structural weaknesses in my own home. Daniel and I met in college. He was finishing his MBA. I was in my second year of architecture school. He was ambitious, polished, the kind of man who always knew which fork to use at dinner. I was drawn to that steadiness. I thought steadiness meant loyalty. I was wrong about that, too. For most of our marriage, things were good, not perfect. No marriage is, but genuinely good. We bought a house in Raleigh, North Carolina, a 4-bedroom colonial on Hargrove Lane that I had renovated almost entirely by myself, on weekends, over 3 years. I knew every inch of that house. I had chosen the hardwood floors, the crown molding, the kitchen tile. I had carried samples home in my purse and held them up against the windows to see how they caught the afternoon light. That house was the most honest thing I had ever made. Daniel worked in commercial real estate development. He traveled frequently, Atlanta, Charlotte, sometimes as far as Dallas. I told myself the distance was just the cost of his ambition. We had talked about starting a family for years. When I finally got pregnant at 33, I thought the timing was perfect. We were stable. We were ready. The first sign came 8 months before everything fell apart. I was working late on a project, and I needed the password to our shared cloud account to retrieve a file Daniel had said he'd uploaded. When I logged in, I found the account had been reorganized. Entire folders had been moved or deleted. I assumed it was a system update. I didn't look closer. The second sign came 3 months later. I found a hotel receipt in the pocket of Daniel's gray blazer while I was taking it to the dry cleaner. The Ritz-Carlton in Charlotte. 2 nights. The dates corresponded with a conference I remembered him mentioning. But I also remembered him calling me from what he said was his hotel room at 9:30 that Friday night. He had described the view of the city. He had asked how I was feeling. I had been having some early pregnancy cramping and was trying not to worry. I held that receipt in the dry cleaner's parking lot for a long time. I still took the blazer inside. I still handed it to the woman behind the counter. I drove home and made dinner and did not say a word. Was I afraid of what I would find if I started asking questions? Yes. Was I also, on some level, already beginning to understand? Yes. Both things were true at once, and I lived inside that contradiction for months. The miscarriage happened on a Tuesday in March. I was 16 weeks along. I had already bought a crib, a white one, simple, from a small shop downtown. It was still in the box in the guest room. I lost the baby at the hospital. Daniel arrived 2 hours after I called him. He smelled faintly of a perfume that wasn't mine. He held my hand in the recovery room and said all the right things, and I looked at the ceiling tiles and counted them, and felt something inside me go very, very quiet. We drove home in silence. I went upstairs and lay down. At 4 o'clock that same afternoon, a process server rang our doorbell. Daniel answered it. I heard voices, then footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway of our bedroom holding a manila envelope, and the look on his face was not grief. It was relief, tightly controlled, wearing the costume of apology. "Claire," he said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't plan for today to happen like this." He set the envelope on the foot of the bed. Divorce papers, filed that morning before he had even come to the hospital. My attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Holt, called me within the hour. Daniel had apparently served her office simultaneously. "Do not sign anything," she said. Her voice was urgent, professional. "Claire, do you hear me? Do not sign a single document." I heard her. I picked up the pen, and I signed every page. Daniel watched from the doorway. I could see the tension leave his shoulders. I could see him calculating, quietly, the way he always calculated, what this meant for him. He didn't know what it meant for me. He had no idea I had already started. The days after the miscarriage and the divorce papers were the quietest of my life. Not peaceful. Quiet the way a house is quiet after something in it has broken. You can hear every small sound with terrible clarity. The refrigerator humming, the wind against the windows, the absence of a heartbeat that should have been there. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to grieve, to cry, to sit on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning and feel the full weight of everything I had lost. The baby, the marriage, the version of my life I had believed in. I let myself feel all of it, because I knew if I didn't, it would follow me. Grief is like that. It waits. On the 4th day, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. I made 2 columns. On the left, what I had. On the right, what Daniel thought he was taking. Let me explain the financial structure of our marriage because it matters. When we bought the house on Hargrove Lane, I contributed 60% of the down payment from savings I had accumulated before we were married. The renovations, nearly $90,000 over 3 years, were paid largely from my income. Daniel's salary had always been higher than mine, but his spending was also higher. He drove a leased BMW. He wore custom suits. He took clients to expensive dinners and categorized them as business expenses. I was the one who quietly saved. I was the one who read the fine print. What Daniel didn't know, what he had apparently miscalculated because he had always underestimated me in small, invisible ways, was that 14 months earlier, I had consulted a financial attorney after finding that hotel receipt, not to file for divorce, not yet, but because something in me, that part that had spent 15 years calculating structural stress, knew that something in the architecture of my marriage was cracking, and I needed to understand what I was standing on. That attorney's name was Robert Keene. He was 60 years old, quiet, meticulous, and he had spent 30 years doing forensic financial work in family law cases. He wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and he spoke to me without condescension, which I appreciated. I didn't tell Daniel about those meetings. I sat at the kitchen table on that 4th morning and wrote down everything Robert and I had discussed. The savings accounts I had moved, legally, carefully, with full documentation, into a personal account that predated our marriage. The contractor invoices I had kept for every renovation project, every receipt, every canceled check, organized by year in a filing cabinet in my office at work. The independent appraisal I had quietly commissioned on the house 8 months ago, which valued it significantly higher than the figure Daniel's attorney had used in the divorce filing. But there was something else, something I hadn't yet confirmed but suspected. The business Daniel had told me he was growing, a development partnership he'd launched 2 years ago with a colleague named Greg Whitfield, had been generating income he had not disclosed to me. I had seen a number once, briefly, on a bank statement that came to the house before Daniel switched everything to paperless, a number that didn't match what he had described to me as the partnership's early losses. How much money had he been hiding, and for how long? I wrote those questions on the legal pad and underlined them twice. Patricia Holt, my attorney, met me at her office on Thursday morning, 4 days after the papers were served. She was composed and direct, which was what I needed. She wanted to discuss our strategy for contesting the filing. "You signed the initial acknowledgement," she said carefully, "but you haven't signed the financial settlement agreement. That's the critical document. That's where he's trying to take the house." The settlement Daniel's attorney had proposed was, to put it plainly, constructed to strip me. He wanted the house valued at the lower figure, one his attorney had obtained from a cursory drive-by appraisal. He wanted to classify his business partnership income as speculative and therefore exempt from marital assets. He wanted me to waive any claim to his retirement accounts in exchange for a lump sum that sounded reasonable until you understood what those accounts would actually be worth in 20 years. He had designed it to look fair. That was the part that told me he had been planning this for a long time. "We're going to need a forensic accountant," I told Patricia. She nodded slowly. "That takes time and money." "I know." I had already called Robert Keene. He had referred me to a forensic accountant he worked with regularly, a woman named Sandra Okafor. Sandra had agreed to a preliminary consultation. "And the house?" Patricia asked. "I have the independent appraisal, and I have every receipt from every renovation I did for 3 years." I placed a folder on her desk. It was 2 inches thick. "I want a counter appraisal filed within the week." Patricia opened the folder. She was quiet for a moment, turning pages. Then she looked up. "Claire," she said, "how long have you been preparing for this?" "Long enough," I said. What I didn't tell her yet was the other part of the plan, the part that wasn't about the house or the money, the part that was about Brittany Hayes, a name I had only recently confirmed, but which I had suspected for much longer, because the divorce, I had come to understand, was not only about Daniel wanting out of a marriage. It was about Daniel wanting to be with someone else, and that someone else, it turned out, had a connection to his business partnership that was far more complicated than either of them knew I was aware of. I drove home through the March streets, the trees not yet in bloom, the sky that flat gray that North Carolina does in early spring. I thought about the house on Hargrove Lane, about the crib in the guest room, still in the box. I thought, he picked the wrong day and he picked the wrong woman. And then I went home and I kept planning. The forensic accountant's name was Sandra Okafor, and she operated out of a modest office on the 4th floor of a building downtown. The kind of office with institutional carpeting and metal filing cabinets and a view of the parking structure next door. None of that mattered. What mattered was that she had spent 18 years untangling hidden assets in high-conflict divorce cases. And she had a reputation, Patricia told me, for finding things that people were absolutely certain could not be found. We met on a Monday morning, 9 days after Daniel served me with papers. Sandra was a tall woman in her mid-50s, precise in her movements, with a way of asking questions that felt neutral but was anything but. She took notes in a small leather notebook rather than on a computer. She said she found that people were more careful in their answers when they saw a pen moving. I brought her everything I had: 3 years of joint tax returns, statements from our shared accounts, the contractor invoices from the Hargrove Lane renovations, the partial bank statement I had photographed before Daniel switched everything to paperless. A decision he had told me was about going green, and which I had accepted at the time because I had no reason not to. Sandra looked at the photograph of that bank statement for a long time. "This account," she said, tapping the paper. "This isn't a joint account." "No, it's in his name only. I only saw it once." "The routing number," she said quietly, "is from a business account, not a personal one." We looked at each other. "He ran personal deposits through a business account," I said. "Possibly. Or he ran business income through a structure designed to make it look like something else." She set the photograph down. "I'm going to need his business formation documents, the partnership agreement with Whitfield, and any tax filings associated with Whitfield Morrison Development. Can you get those? Some of it is discoverable in litigation. Your attorney files a formal financial disclosure request. He's legally obligated to produce those documents." She paused. "He won't like it." "No," I said, "he won't." I left her office and walked to my car and sat in the parking structure for a few minutes with the windows up. Outside, I could hear the low sound of traffic moving through the streets. The ordinary world carrying on. How does a man plan the end of a marriage while his wife is still carrying their child? I had been asking myself that question since the afternoon at the hospital. I still didn't have an answer that made full sense to me. But I was beginning to understand that the question mattered less than what I was going to do about it. Patricia filed the formal financial disclosure request that Wednesday. By Thursday morning, Daniel's attorney, a man named Harris Fowler, known in Raleigh legal circles as someone who specialized in making unfavorable settlements look inevitable, called Patricia's office 3 times before noon. Patricia relayed the calls to me that evening. "He's telling us that our request is overly broad and that his client objects to the scope of discovery." "He can object," I said. "We'll let the court decide the scope." There was a brief silence. "Claire, Fowler doesn't usually make 3 calls in one morning unless something we've done has alarmed him." "Good," I said. Around this same time, I noticed a shift in Daniel's behavior. He had moved to a furnished apartment in Midtown, and for the first 2 weeks after filing, his communication had been formal and minimal. Messages relayed through attorneys. But now he started appearing in peripheral ways. He called my cell directly one evening, which he wasn't supposed to do without his attorney present. I didn't answer. He texted twice. "Can we talk? Just us, without lawyers." I screenshotted both messages and sent them to Patricia. He was beginning to understand that something wasn't going the way he had expected. What he didn't yet know was the specific thing I had found 3 days earlier. It happened while I was going through a box of old documents I had kept in my office storage closet. The systematic kind of search you do when you're looking for anything you might have overlooked. At the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old project portfolios, I found a folder I didn't recognize. Inside was a printed email chain. One that Daniel must have accidentally placed in my files, maybe during a period when we shared the home office. The emails were between Daniel and Brittany Hayes. Brittany Hayes was not just the woman Daniel was involved with romantically. She was also a licensed real estate agent who worked in the same market where Whitfield Morrison Development operated. The email chain was 18 months old. In it, Daniel and Brittany discussed, in detail that left no room for misinterpretation, a series of property listings she had steered toward his partnership at below-market commission rates in exchange for arrangements that, reading carefully between the professional language, were clearly personal. She was helping him hide income. and he was compensating her in ways that didn't appear in any account I had access to. I sat in my office with the door closed and read those emails 3 times. Then I made a copy, put the original in a sealed envelope, and delivered it to Patricia Holt's office by hand. "This changes things significantly," Patricia said, reading through the pages with the careful focus of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. "I know. This isn't just a divorce, Claire. This is potentially financial fraud." "I know that too." She looked up. "Are you prepared for this to get complicated?" I thought about the house on Hargrove Lane, about the crib in the guest room, about the smell of perfume in a hospital room where I had just lost my child. "Patricia," I said, "it was already complicated. I'm just the only one who understood that." She nodded once, set the papers down, and began to make notes. That was the point of no return. Not the day Daniel handed me the divorce papers, not the day I signed the acknowledgement with a steady hand while he watched from the doorway, thinking he had already won. This was it. This was where the architecture of his plan began to show its cracks. And I knew exactly where to apply the pressure. The formal discovery process moved faster than Daniel had expected, and I could tell by the silence from his side, that particular weighted silence that precedes a reaction, that Fowler had advised him to wait and see what we actually had before responding. It was a strategic pause. I recognized it because I had used the same pause in professional negotiations. Hold still, assess, then move. They didn't hold still long. Sandra Okafor, working with the documents Patricia's office had subpoenaed, identified a series of transactions within Whitfield Morrison Development that had been structured specifically to defer reportable income across 2 fiscal years. It wasn't crude. It wasn't the kind of thing that would be obvious to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. But Sandra had looked carefully, and what she found was that Daniel's share of the partnership's actual earnings over the previous 2 years was substantially higher than the figure his attorney had disclosed in the financial settlement proposal. Higher by an amount that changed the entire landscape of what I was entitled to. Patricia filed an amended financial claim on a Tuesday morning in late April. By Tuesday afternoon, Fowler's office had called 3 times. By Wednesday, Daniel called my cell phone himself, twice, both calls ignored. On Thursday morning, I arrived at my office downtown, a 3-room suite on the 2nd floor of a brick building near the university, where I had run my architecture practice for 6 years, and found Daniel standing in the small parking lot behind the building. He was leaning against his car, the BMW, of course. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and he looked like a man who had not slept well in several nights, which should have given me satisfaction and instead just made me feel very tired. "Claire," he straightened when he saw me. "I need 5 minutes." "You need to call your attorney," I said. I kept walking. "I'm not here as your legal opponent." He moved to cut off my path, not aggressively, but deliberately. "I'm here as someone who is asking you to stop this before it gets worse." I stopped. I looked at him. "Before it gets worse for whom, Daniel?" Something crossed his face. Not guilt. I want to be honest about this. It looked more like frustration, the expression of a man who had prepared for a certain kind of conversation and found himself in a different one. "You don't understand what you're doing. This discovery process, what your attorney is requesting, it's going to implicate people who have nothing to do with us." "Brittany Hayes," I said. The word landed. I watched him process it, watched the careful control on his face waver for exactly 2 seconds before he locked it back down. He was good at controlling his expressions. He had always been good at that. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that this can still be resolved without destroying everything." Then you should have thought about that before you served me divorce papers on the day I lost our baby. I walked past him. I went upstairs and sat at my desk for 20 minutes before my hands stopped shaking. Not from fear, from anger, which is a different kind of shaking, one that comes from somewhere deeper and takes longer to pass. That evening, Fowler sent Patricia a letter. It was professionally worded and several paragraphs long, but its meaning was simple. Withdraw the amended financial claim and return to the original settlement terms, or Daniel's side would pursue a counterfiling alleging that I had improperly accessed and retained confidential business documents. The printed email chain I had found in my own storage closet, in my own files. Confidential business documents, in a box in my office that I had maintained for 6 years. Patricia called me immediately. "It's a pressure tactic," she said. "They don't have a real legal basis for it. But I want you to be aware that they're going to try to make this uncomfortable." "How uncomfortable?" "They mentioned your professional licenses, the implication being that they could file a complaint with the state licensing board. A nuisance complaint, nothing with real merit. But it would create noise. It would take time and attention to address." I was quiet for a moment. Through my living room window, the Hargrove Lane neighborhood was doing its evening things. A neighbor walking her dog, the sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. Normal, ordinary, untouched by any of this. "File a motion to compel full financial disclosure," I said, "and let's get a protective order on the email chain establishing that it was found in my personal files and is properly in my possession." "Already drafted," Patricia said. "I just wanted to make sure you were ready." "I'm ready." The motion was filed the following morning. Fowler's counter-complaint about the documents was addressed in the same motion, cleanly, factually, with the documentation of how and where the emails had been found, including a signed statement from my office building manager confirming that the storage closet was part of my leased office space and had been since I opened my practice. It took the wind out of their pressure campaign immediately. Daniel and Fowler went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time, not strategic but regrouping. I gave myself the last weekend of April to stop. I drove out to the mountains, a small rental cabin outside Asheville that a friend had recommended years ago, and I had never visited. I left my laptop in the car. I walked a trail each morning. I ate simple food. I sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the last of the day go out of the sky, and I let myself be very still. I thought about the baby. I let myself grieve that fully, without the noise of legal strategy or anger. I thought about the woman I was becoming through all of this. Harder in some ways, yes, but also clearer, purposeful. Built, I thought, the way good structures are built. Not to be pretty under easy conditions, but to hold when the pressure is real. On Sunday evening, I drove back to Raleigh. I was ready to continue. May came in warm and green. The dogwoods in the Hargrove Lane yard, the ones I had planted the second spring after we moved in, were in bloom, and every morning when I backed out of the driveway, I made a point to look at them. I had planted those trees. They were still there. Whatever Daniel had planned to take, he had not planned to take those. The call came on a Wednesday evening just after 7. It wasn't from Daniel's attorney. It was from Daniel himself, calling from a number I didn't recognize, which told me he was being careful about what appeared in his call records. I answered, because I had decided weeks ago that the days of avoiding information were behind me. Claire. His voice was measured, stripped of the urgency I had heard in the parking lot. He had regrouped. "I've been thinking about what you said." I said nothing. "I was wrong about the timing," he continued. "What happened in March, the hospital, I handled that badly. I know that. Handled that badly. He had served divorce papers the same afternoon I left the hospital after losing our child, and he was describing it as bad handling. I noted the language precisely, the way I would note a miscalculation in a blueprint. What do you want, Daniel? I want to propose something. A full settlement, a real one, not the one Fowler drafted. I'm willing to negotiate the house valuation. I'm willing to talk about the partnership income. A pause. I just need the discovery process to stop. There it was. The discovery process, I said, is governed by the court at this point. It doesn't stop because you're willing to talk. It stops if we reach an agreement. Another pause. Longer. Brittany is a licensed real estate agent. What's in those emails, if it becomes part of a public court record? It affects her career, her livelihood. She has nothing to do with the legal issues between us. I almost laughed, not from cruelty, but from the sheer geometry of what he was trying to do, asking me to protect the woman he had chosen over our marriage, over our child, out of some appeal to my compassion. Daniel, I said calmly, if Brittany Hayes engaged in conduct that violated her professional obligations, that's a matter between her and her licensing board. It's not a matter between you and me. Claire, this conversation should be happening through our attorneys. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet around me. The dogwoods were dark outside the window. I was aware of something that I wanted to name accurately. I was not angry. I was not tempted. I was simply certain, in the way you are certain of a structural fact, that I was doing the right thing and that I would continue to do it. That clarity felt different from anything I had felt in the earlier weeks. In the beginning, I had been running on determination and adrenaline, which is a real kind of fuel but an unstable one. What I had now was something steadier. 2 days later, Daniel sent a more formal overture through Fowler, an offer that was meaningfully better than the original settlement, specifically better on the house valuation and the partnership income. Patricia laid it out on her desk between us and let me read it without commentary. It was almost fair. That was the precise word. Almost. It addressed the financial issues in ways that acknowledged what Sandra had found, but it asked me to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of the divorce, the email chain, or anything related to Whitfield Morrison development for the rest of my life. They want to buy your silence, Patricia said finally. I know. I set the offer down. No. She didn't argue. She had stopped arguing with my decisions several weeks ago, I think, because she had understood something about the consistency of my intentions. Around this time, I told my sister. Her name is Rachel. She lives in Greensboro, an hour's drive from Raleigh, and she is 4 years older than me, and has always been the person in my life who says exactly what she thinks, without softening it for politeness. I had kept the full details from her until now, partly to protect my own processing time, partly because I knew that once Rachel knew everything, it would become very real in the way that things become real when another person witnesses them. She drove to Raleigh on a Saturday morning. We sat in my kitchen and I told her all of it. The hotel receipt, the hospital, the papers served the same afternoon, the emails, the hidden income, the pressure campaign, the NDA offer. I told her about the baby, too, the things I hadn't said to anyone, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, which is not Rachel's natural mode and is therefore the greatest gift she knows how to give. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" Not "I'm so sorry," not "I can't believe he did this," just "What do you need?" "I need someone to know the whole story," I said. in case anything happens, in case I have a moment where I doubt myself. You won't doubt yourself, she said, but I'm here. She stayed the weekend. She helped me go through the guest room and move the crib to storage. Carefully, not discarded, just moved. And we painted the room a shade of blue I had been considering for months. We ordered takeout and watched old movies, and on Sunday morning we drove to the farmer's market and bought bread and flowers and walked in the early May sunshine like people who were simply living their lives. I was living my life, even in the middle of all of it. Daniel and Fowler were watching, waiting to see if the settlement offer had softened me. They would wait a little longer. The call came on a Tuesday evening in the second week of May, and it wasn't Daniel this time. It was Brittany Hayes. I had never spoken to her before. I had seen her once from a distance, at a charity auction the previous autumn that Daniel and I had attended together. She was a few years younger than me, blonde, dressed well, with the kind of practiced ease that comes from always knowing how a room perceives you. At the auction, she and Daniel had exchanged the kind of brief, careful greeting that people practice when they've agreed in advance how to behave in shared spaces. I had noticed it. I had filed it. "Claire," she said on the phone, her voice warm, carefully warm, the warmth of someone who has rehearsed. "I know this is unexpected. I want you to know I don't expect you to be comfortable with this call." "Then why make it?" I said. "Because I think we've both been made to look like adversaries in a situation that doesn't need to be that way." A brief pause. "I think Daniel's attorneys have made this more adversarial than it needs to be. I had nothing to do with those legal decisions." I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the spring evening was settling in, the sky going that particular pale gold that North Carolina does beautifully, light spilling across the yard and catching the dogwood branches. Had nothing to do with those legal decisions. The woman whose name appeared in 18 months of emails discussing how to structure real estate transactions to conceal income. "What is it you're proposing, Brittany?" I kept my voice neutral. "I'm proposing a conversation. The four of us, you and me and both our attorneys, off the record. No court filings, no discovery, just a conversation about what a reasonable resolution looks like." She paused again. "You're a professional woman, Claire. So am I. I think we understand each other in a way that Daniel and the lawyers don't." There it was, the appeal to female solidarity, deployed by the woman who had been helping my husband hide money while I was renovating our home and planning for a child we would never bring home from the hospital. I noted the manipulation with a kind of cold precision, not with anger. I was past the kind of anger that clouds things. Just, I see what this is. "An off-the-record conversation," I said, "has no legal value. I have no interest in it." "Claire," and here her voice shifted, barely, just a degree, the warmth thinning. "You need to understand that pursuing this in court, the way you're pursuing it, has consequences that go beyond your settlement. Greg Whitfield is involved in this partnership. He has a family. He has employees. If this goes to a full financial disclosure hearing, there are people who will be affected who have done nothing to you personally." I understood her immediately. She wasn't apologizing. She was threatening me with the collateral impact on third parties as a reason to stand down. It was a more sophisticated version of what Daniel had tried in my parking lot. "Brittany," I said, "if Greg Whitfield's business practices are legally sound, he has nothing to worry about. If they're not, that's a matter for the appropriate authorities." I paused. "And I think you know which of those is true." Silence. "I'd like you not to call me again unless it's through your attorney," I said, and I ended the call. I put the phone down on the table. The pale gold outside had deepened to orange. I looked at it. "I want to be honest about this. I was afraid. Not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, but genuinely. There was a small, clear fear in my chest, the kind that comes from understanding that you are fighting real opponents with real resources, and that the space between where you are and where you need to be is not yet closed. But the fear did something interesting. Instead of making me want to retreat, to take the settlement offer, to sign the NDA, to simply end this and start over somewhere smaller, it made me want to continue. Not out of rage or pride, but because backing down from this felt physically wrong. The way standing in a building is structurally unsound feels wrong. Every instinct in my professional training is designed to identify that wrongness and correct it. I called Patricia the next morning and told her about both calls, Daniel's earlier inquiry and now Brittany's. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "They're coordinating," she said. "Yes." "Which means they're nervous." "Yes." "The hearing for the financial disclosure motion is in 3 weeks," Patricia said. "I want to move for an additional deposition, specifically of Brittany Hayes, in her capacity as the agent involved in the transactions Sandra identified. If she's acting as a third-party material witness, we can depose her." I thought about Brittany's carefully warm voice on the phone, the rehearsed solidarity, the threat wrapped in professional language. "Do it," I said. Patricia filed the deposition motion the same afternoon. By evening, Fowler's office had responded with a furious counter-motion, citing harassment and overreach. A judge would rule on the scope within the week. The antagonists did not call again, but I knew they were watching, recalibrating, preparing something I couldn't yet see. I went home that evening and stood in the kitchen and let myself feel the small fear for exactly as long as it needed to run. Then I put it away. I had work to do. The financial disclosure hearing was set for a Thursday morning in early June. The courtroom was a standard civil courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Wake County Courthouse. Institutional lighting, wooden gallery benches, the particular flat silence of a room where the heating system is too loud and everyone ignores it. I wore a gray blazer and carried a leather portfolio. I had chosen the gray blazer deliberately. I wanted to look like someone who had dressed for a professional meeting, not a performance. Patricia and I arrived 20 minutes early. Daniel was already seated at the opposing table with Fowler, and he didn't look up when I walked in. Brittany Hayes was present as a potential witness, seated in the gallery on Fowler's side, composed but, and this was my reading of it, possibly biased, wearing the expression of someone who had told herself many times that morning that she would be fine. The judge was the Honorable Margaret Cleland, a woman in her early 60s who was known, Patricia had told me, for running a tight hearing and having very little patience for procedural gamesmanship. She had a way of looking at an attorney over her reading glasses that apparently communicated a great deal without a word. The hearing began with Sandra Okafor's testimony. Sandra had been deposed before, many times, in many cases, and it showed. She was methodical and unhurried, presenting her findings in language that was technical enough to be credible and clear enough to be understood. She walked through the structure of Whitfield Morrison development, the pattern of transactions she had identified, the 2-year income deferral, and the specific role that Brittany Hayes's below-market commission arrangements had played in suppressing the partnership's reportable earnings. Fowler cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He questioned her methodology, her qualifications, the completeness of her documentation. Sandra answered every question in the same measured, even tone. She did not become defensive. She did not over-explain. She simply said what was true and let it sit there, because truth, placed carefully and quietly into a room, is extraordinarily difficult to displace. During a brief recess, I watched Daniel lean close to Fowler and speak quietly. Fowler's expression was composed, but I had been watching him all morning and I had learned to read the small tells. He pressed his pen against the table when something concerned him. He was pressing it now. Then Brittany Hayes was called to the stand. I want to describe this carefully because what happened mattered, and I don't want to overstate it for dramatic effect. Brittany was, under questioning from Patricia, composed and professional for the first several minutes. She answered questions about her license, her business, her general professional practices. She was good, I will give her that. But Patricia's questioning was structured like a building. Each question was a floor, and you couldn't skip them. She asked about Brittany's professional relationship with Whitfield Morrison. Brittany acknowledged it in general terms. She asked about specific listing transactions, 6 of them, named by address, with dates. Brittany began to be more careful with her answers, more qualified, more reliant on phrases like, "I'd need to check my records," and "I believe that was standard practice in that market." Then Patricia produced the email chain. Judge Cleland had already ruled it properly admissible. It had been found in my possession, in my files, and there was no dispute about its authenticity. When Patricia read specific excerpts aloud, not the personal content, which was secondary, but the professional content, the specific language about commission arrangements and timing, something changed in Brittany's face. Not collapse. I want to be accurate. It wasn't a movie-style breakdown. It was subtler, a kind of tightening, a visible effort to hold the composure she had brought into the room. And then, under a specific question about a particular email from November 2 years ago, Patricia asked her to confirm whether she had sent it, and Brittany said, "I don't recall sending that specific email." Daniel, at the opposing table, turned in his chair. He turned toward Brittany, a small movement, involuntary, and in that movement he communicated silently, something that neither of them intended to show in a courtroom, a concern about what she would say next that was much more specific than innocent professional anxiety. Judge Cleland noticed. I was watching her watch him. Fowler objected to the next question, which bought a moment, but the moment had already passed. Patricia continued methodically. By the end of Brittany's testimony, the picture Sandra's financial analysis had drawn was now corroborated. Not conclusively, not criminally so, but corroborated in a civil evidentiary standard that was sufficient for our purposes, sufficient to establish that Daniel's disclosed financial position was substantially inaccurate and that the concealment was not accidental. Daniel was called. Fowler had prepared him well, and he answered within careful parameters. But Patricia had one question she'd been building toward the entire morning. She placed in front of him a tax document, his personal filing from 2 years ago, and a Whitfield Morrison quarterly earnings statement Sandra had obtained through discovery. The numbers did not align. The gap between them was not small. "Can you explain," Patricia said quietly, "the discrepancy between these 2 figures?" Daniel looked at the documents. He looked at Fowler. Fowler gave him a careful, almost imperceptible nod. "Answer within what we discussed." And Daniel looked back at the documents and began to speak, and what he said was a technically constructed non-answer that anyone in the room could hear was not an answer. Judge Cleland stopped him. "Mr. Morrison," she said in the voice Patricia had described, the one over the reading glasses, "let me ask the question differently. Was the income reflected in this quarterly statement reported in its entirety on your personal tax return for that year?" The room was quiet. Daniel said, I relied on my accountant for those filings. Judge Cleland looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned to Patricia. Counsel, I've heard enough for the purposes of this motion. I'm going to order full financial disclosure across all Whitfield Morrison accounts for the past 4 years, and I'm referring this matter to the appropriate tax authority for review. She looked at Fowler. I'd advise your client to consult with someone beyond civil litigation counsel. The gavel came down. I sat very still in my chair. Patricia touched my arm briefly, a small professional acknowledgement. I looked at Daniel. He was staring at the table. Beside him, Fowler was writing something on a legal pad with careful, deliberate strokes, the behavior of a man organizing his thoughts after a significant setback. I didn't feel triumph. I want to say that clearly. I felt something quieter. The specific, sober feeling of standing in a structure you have built correctly and watching it hold weight the way you calculated it would. Not joy. Confirmation. I gathered my portfolio. I walked out of the courtroom into the courthouse hallway, where the light came through tall windows and the ordinary world went about its business on the sidewalk below. Rachel was waiting on a bench outside the courtroom. She stood when she saw my face. "Well," she said. "It held," I said. She hugged me. Outside, it was a June morning, and the city was bright. After Judge Cleland's ruling, the nature of the proceedings shifted decisively. The weight had redistributed. Everything that had been straining against my position now began to fall in the direction of its own logic. Harris Fowler withdrew from the case within 3 days of the hearing, citing a conflict arising from the evolution of issues in this matter. His careful way of saying the case had expanded into territory his reputation couldn't afford. Daniel hired a new attorney, a solo practitioner named Marcus Webb, who called Patricia within his first week and asked, plainly, what it would take to reach a resolution. Patricia called me that evening and read me the question. "Tell him," I said, "that we're prepared to discuss a full settlement based on accurate financial disclosure. All of it. The partnership income, the asset valuations, the retirement accounts. Based on what was actually earned, not what was reported. And the NDA? There is no NDA. The settlement negotiations lasted 11 days. I did not participate directly. I had done the work of building the case. Patricia could carry it across the finish line. I went to my office. I worked. I took long walks. I inhabited my life. The terms, when they came, were these. I retained full ownership of the house on Hargrove Lane, valued at my independent appraisal figure. I received 50% of the actual documented value of Daniel's stake in Whitfield Morrison Development, calculated on Sandra Okafor's findings. I received an equitable share of his retirement accounts and a structured settlement payment covering the marriage, calculated properly. The final number was more than double what the original settlement would have given me. Daniel signed on a Friday morning. I signed that afternoon in Patricia's office. She poured a small glass of sparkling water and handed it to me. I thought, this is what winning looks like. Quiet, documented, irrevocable. Whitfield Morrison Development was effectively suspended pending the tax authority's review. Greg Whitfield hired his own attorneys and separated himself from Daniel publicly and promptly. Brittany Hayes' license was put under review following a complaint from another agent in her market who had noticed the same pattern of below-market commissions. I did not orchestrate it. Reality completed the picture on its own. Daniel sold his share of the partnership at a significantly reduced price. The market for an interest under tax review is not a strong one. He left Raleigh. The crib in the storage unit I addressed on a September afternoon with Rachel there. We donated it to an organization that provides nursery furniture to families who can't afford it. I looked at it for a long time. Then I let it go. What does it feel like to have won? It felt like deep structural relief, the kind when a load is properly distributed at last and nothing is straining beyond its capacity. It didn't feel like revenge. Revenge implies a desire to injure. What I had wanted was accuracy, an accurate account of what I was owed, what had been taken, what the truth actually was. I had that now, on record, in the daylight. That was enough. That was everything. The summer I turned 35, I repainted the living room. The color was a warm cream I had been saving in my mental files for years. First seen in a small hotel lobby in Savannah on a trip with Rachel, and I had thought then, someday, somewhere, this is the right color for a room I will actually live in. That someday was this summer in the house on Hargrove Lane, which was entirely and legally mine. I took on more projects. The Chapel Hill addition became, finally, the project I was proud of. A kitchen and family room extension that opened beautifully onto a backyard for a family who had me over for dinner after it was finished. I sat at their table, centered in a space I'd designed, and felt the satisfaction of work that is honest and durable. My practice grew. I hired an associate named May, meticulous, quietly fierce, 2 years out of school, and gave her real work and the authority to do it well. She didn't disappoint me. I started running again, 3 mornings a week along the Greenway. The sound of my own footsteps, the early morning air, my body operating within its own reliable rhythms. These things gave me back something I hadn't known I'd surrendered during the years of the marriage. Rachel came for a long weekend in the fall. We cooked, opened a good bottle of wine, sat at the table until late. "You seem different," she said, "settled, like you're standing on ground that actually belongs to you." "I think I am," I said. As for Daniel and Brittany, Whitfield Morrison Development was formally dissolved in October. Daniel had moved to South Carolina, where a mutual acquaintance described him as managing rather than thriving. He had left with far less than he'd planned, and the professional fallout from the tax review followed him in ways that are difficult to escape when reputation functions as currency. Brittany's license was placed on formal probationary status. She relocated to Georgia. I didn't follow the details beyond that. What I knew was that she had left the Raleigh market, and the circumstances that had made her behavior possible had left with her. I thought about both of them occasionally, less as time passed, not with satisfaction, which requires attention, but with a particular absence of feeling that comes when something that once caused pain is no longer relevant to the shape of your days. In November, I went back to the mountains. I walked trails, ate simply, sat on the porch in the evenings. The mountains were the same. I was different in them. The dogwoods in the Hargrove Lane yard bloomed that next April, white flowers against the spring sky, alive and rooted. I stood in the yard one morning and looked at them. I built this, I thought, and it held.